Some German bishops are pushing for change in the church as Pope Leo continues to reshape the Vatican through his appointments. With analysis, I'm joined by the Papal Posse editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. And look, the whole gang is here on set. It's practically a summer miracle. Thank you both for coming out. I want to start with something I just discussed with Assistant U.S. Attorney General Harmeet Dillon. The government's lawsuit against the state of Washington's new law, which forces Catholic priests to divulge whatever they might hear in a confession if it touches on child abuse or child neglect. Father, Harmeet said the Washington state law is an example of anti-Catholicism. Your take on this from a canonical and legal perspective?
Yes, well, canonically, Catholic priests are bound to observe total secrecy about what they learn in confession. And that's a known tenet of our faith. That's part of canon law. Yeah. So for any government to intrude on that is therefore violating the free exercise of religion. Catholic priests will no longer be able to minister to people in the sacrament of confession when they're threatened by prosecution. So, yeah, I'm glad that the United States is taking up this case because this is so flagrant. I can't imagine any founding father thinking that this is what they meant when they had the religious liberty clause in the Constitution.
Bob, why do you think we see these constant cases? I mean, we've seen this before, where legislators, they focus intently on cracking open the sacrality and the secrecy of confession. What's driving that?
Well, look, I think that all of these cases are driven by a basic desire for a cultural revolution in the country. The governor of the state of Washington, who is a Catholic, put this in terms that are absolutely absurd. He said, I can't believe that my church is advocating for protecting people who abuse children. Well, that's not what this case is over. It's over protecting a church from an intrusion by the state. And you see this in the kind of unequal way in which coercion is being applied. I mean, we're being told that teachers have no responsibility to inform parents about what I regard as child abuse, which is to say when they begin to help them with transitions and very serious use of puberty blockers or surgeries. And yet our states are protecting the guidance counselors and others from having to speak about that. Yeah. But all of a sudden Catholic priests, and by the way, Catholic priests, if you, I don't know, maybe Father wants to comment about this. When I talk to priests about what do you do when a guy comes in and says, I just committed murder?
Yeah.
You don't just tell them, well, you know, totos. You get
three Hail Marys.
Right, 3 Hail Marys. What you do is you generally, this is at least what I hear from priests, you try to tell them, okay, why don't you go to the authorities? If you're really repentant, you go to the authorities and you talk about it. So this is intruding in the way that people are going to actually conduct spiritual counseling in the privacy of the confessional. And we know why this is. It's because they don't want the church to be independent of the state. They want control over that.
Father, I know you.
Yeah, no, Bob is absolutely right. And this cultural pattern is always against Catholicism in this country. You know, it targets the Catholic Church. Why is it that other groups aren't being prosecuted in a similar fashion? Bob is right.
Yeah. Now, I want to go to another case that drew my eye this week. Another example of government encroachment into church affairs. This time, the Canadian government has ordered a euthanasia facility to be opened and operated on the campus of St. Paul's, a Catholic hospital in Vancouver. It's now fully operational. Plans for such facilities are underway in other parts of the community. These so-called MAID facilities, medical aid in dying, where a terminally ill patient can request a prescription for life-ending drugs and then self-administer the medication if they choose. Father, how is this even permissible at a Catholic hospital?
Well, it's completely impermissible, and this is the overreaching state in Canada doing this. You know, it'd be ironic. Maybe they'll place it next to the anti-suicide counseling room for people they bring in who tried to jump off a bridge. And if it doesn't work there, then they just bring them next door. No, imagine what the Canadian government is doing. They're telling people the government fully supports your desire to kill yourself. Today it's going to be people who are sick and old. Tomorrow it's going to be anybody who shows up.
Yeah.
This is horrible.
You're depressed. Yeah. Bob, euthanasia is being legalized across the U.S. And indeed, these MAID facilities are already in some states, New Jersey, New Mexico, even here in Washington, D.C. Do you expect to see more of this, even in Catholic hospital settings?
Well, I pray to God no, but part of the problem here, of course, is a legal problem, that once you engage the government in supporting legitimate medical practices that are being carried out in the hospitals, well, then of course there are strings that come attached to this. I remember back when Obamacare was being debated, and there was a question about how abortion was going to be finessed in the coverage of Obamacare. And our Catholic medical associations here in the United States, up to the highest level of the leadership, got on board with it. I think not just naively, but because they just wanted to keep the status quo the way it is. So, look, the basic problem is that we've got the ideological question of we're going to have now we're also seeing in places like England not only the euthanasia but also abortion right up to the point of being delivered. Wow. So there's death at both ends of life, and it's going to be pushed by the government even on sectarian medical facilities like Catholic hospitals. I think this is a horrible development.
Terrible idea. Gents, the Catholic Church continues to collapse in Germany. 2 German bishops this week called for the liberalization of the Church's teaching on homosexuality. Bishop Peter Kohlgroth of Mainz says the Bible has, quote, no eternal truths on homosexuality, instead urging the Church to take such teachings in their contemporary context. Meanwhile, the Bishop of Dresden, Heinrich Timmer-Evers, says a new way of thinking is needed on the subject of homosexuality, urging a change in teaching, since His Excellency does not understand which conditions the Church can speak of serious sin concerning homosexuality, if at all. Father, your reaction?
First thing is both bishops should repent or resign their office because they're no longer suitable to carry out what they swore by oath when they were ordained bishops, which is uphold Catholic teaching. The notion that there is nothing in sacred scripture that contains the value of eternal truth about morality, this is ridiculous. A bishop to state that means he no longer accepts, through his statements, the duty he's been given by God, which is to guide the flock according to the truth. This is a really bad thing. The Holy See has to stop these bishops, because this is like, water seeping under cement. Suddenly the whole thing's going to collapse.
Yeah, and we see Cardinal Walter Casper, 92 years old, still stirring it up, Bob. This week he just came out in an interview where he suggested pushing the diaconate, female diaconate, and he says there is a wall between a deacon and a priest, so you can allow female diaconate with no fear of them being made priests. Your thought?
Yeah, right. No, we know how this begins.
Yeah, this story
ends. It starts, it's a salami tactics. You move things along very slowly. Look, in both cases, what we have here is ignoring not only Scripture, but the tradition of the Church. And what they're doing is they're trying to say that somehow there's some modern discovery, that we know something better than 2,000 years of Catholic history. The thing that kills me the most is when they invoke the Galileo case. That, we used to think that the Earth went around the sun. Now we know that the sun goes around the Earth. Yeah. Now we know that it's actually the Earth that goes around the sun. Well, yeah. But the fact is, it still looks the same way, and there still is the same relationship between them. What they're trying to say is if there was some scientific study of what homosexuality is, therefore it just invalidates all the prior moral tradition. It can't possibly be that. Otherwise, people in the Church, and not only about these issues, are going to have to wait for the scientists to tell us whether it's okay to believe the Catholic faith. Yeah. It's an absurdity, and not only is it an absurdity, it's an absurdity from the scientific point of view.
Father, I want your take on this. It's a related story. Father James Martin featured former Cabinet Secretary Pete Buttigieg on his podcast this week, and he took pains to equate Buttigieg's marriage to a man with the Holy Trinity. Watch.
Now I'm in my 40s and I'm a father, and I'm starting to better align with the style that is presented, the style of love and the style of concern that we associate with God the Father.
That's beautiful. I mean, it really does. It's an entree into the Trinity. How about marriage? Does marriage change your relationship with God or your understanding of God's love?
Father, your reaction?
Well, number one, Father Martin should know that Mr. Buttigieg is not married to that other man, because that's impossible. If he doesn't believe that, then he too should resign as a priest, because the Catholic Church teaches marriage is only between a man and a woman. So that's the first concern. Secondly, why is he encouraging him in the false notion that what he does with his partner somehow is an image of how God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit exist in the Trinity? Mortal sin is a work of the devil. When we embrace mortal sin, we reject God. This is terrible. Father Martin is leading people and confirming them in sin. This is amazing. His superiors and the Jesuits need to rein him in.
Yeah. Bob, your thoughts on this?
Yeah,
Is this just part of I mean, we see the movement of this with the German church and then in the popular, front through America Magazine.
Look, I think this is a false identification of niceness with charity. Charity is a virtue. It's a theological virtue. It's rooted in God. It's rooted in the truth and in goodness. And instead what they're trying to say is, oh, well, it's nice. Look, you two guys, and you actually adopted 2 children, and Pete took maternity, or is it paternity leave, when he was Secretary of Transportation. It's basing everything on emotion rather than on the truth of what God has established in the world. So I'm not surprised that Father Martin has done this, because I think that he's been playing a double game for a long time. I'm sorry to say this about a Catholic priest, but while he claims that he's teaching the Orthodox faith, he's not telling people to violate it. Well, he has a interview with someone that, by the very fact of conducting it in that way, speaks volumes to people that he's actually in the other camp.
Well, this is like telling a guy who's cheating on your wife, well, look, the mistress and the wife and you, this is a new trinity you've set up. I mean, this is really blasphemous, is what it is. Pope Leo addressed a group of supporters of Christians in the Middle East at the Vatican this morning. He is decrying the diabolic violence of war and people dying because of fake news. Here's the quote. But today the violence of war seems to be hitting the territories of the Middle East with a diabolical vehemence never seen before. The heart bleeds thinking of Ukraine, the tragic and inhuman situation in Gaza, and the Middle East devastated by the spread of war. We are all called, humanity, to evaluate the causes of these conflicts, to verify the real ones and try to overcome them, and to reject the spurious ones, the fruit of emotional simulations and rhetoric, unmasking them decisively. People cannot die because of fake news. It is truly sad to witness today, in many contexts, the imposition of the law of the strongest, on the basis of which one's own interests are legitimized. It is disheartening to see that the force of international law and humanitarian law no longer seem to oblige, replaced by the presumed right to force others. This is unworthy of man. It is shameful for humanity and for those responsible for nations. Bob, I'll give you first crack at this. Your immediate reaction.
Well, my first reaction is I'm surprised that he said this, because he's a man who in the past has shown himself to be a very careful speaker. Yeah. I think that this is a very incautious and maybe even irresponsible way to talk about circumstances. Look, there's fake news about Ukraine. We see all the time people claiming that Russia was provoked into this, it was the West that provoked it. I think that's absolute fake news. They invaded another country, and that is immoral. When it comes to the larger question of the Middle East, however, it's a very much more complicated circumstance. And it's not as if Israel is putting out propaganda that people are accepting. I actually think there's a large pushback against Israel because of what it's been forced to do against Hamas because of the terrible things that happened on October 7th. And as for the end of that quotation, it seems that he's talking about President Trump, frankly. And look, it's hard to say at what point in a nuclear age you can go after someone who's developing a nuclear bomb. Usually, when we talk about just war theory, we don't talk about preventive war. Sometimes you can have preemptive strikes against an opponent. It's hard in the nuclear situation because the stakes are so very, very high that allowing a country that is a hostile and terrorist regime to obtain a nuclear bomb is very dangerous. So you could actually argue the opposite, that for the West not to do anything with Iran would have been immoral. So,
and Iran has been the fomenter and the funder of Hamas, of Hezbollah, that have tortured and terrorized Christian communities throughout the Middle East, Father. We've seen it in Lebanon, Syria. What do you think the Holy Father's getting at here?
Well, I agree with Bob in his analysis. I think this is really not the most measured analysis in such a brief paragraph to try and understand what's happening here. We just had the destruction of a nuclear program by the United States and Israel, developed by a terrorist regime which says death to America and destroy Israel. Yeah. We had their proxies launching attacks on Israel. October 7th is now used as to discuss what happened. Let's see what happened. They murdered women and children. They tortured people. they still have hostages. Why don't we have a daily headline say, Hamas has to release hostages because there's no right in international law to hold hostages? We don't get that. It's all about the Israelis. It always is. The Israelis did not want to start a war with Hamas. They were talking for a, condominium, to live together in some way. So saying that everybody's wrong in the same way, that's moral relativism. I don't accept that.
Yeah, the fake news thing is interesting, though, that's used because, what's the fake news then that we're referring? Was it the nuclear program? Or was it October 7th? What's the fake news, the provocation here? Or he calls the fruit of emotional simulations and rhetoric, unmasking them decisively. That's very vague.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like him. It almost sounds like somebody else wrote that. He generally, in my estimation, doesn't speak in abstract terms.
No. He's usually very precise and measured. And look, one expects the Pope to urge peace. That's the role of the Holy Father. And he did that beautifully on Sunday, I thought. This address is a bit more complicated. I'll post it on X. Gents, Pope Leo XIV has a lot going on this week, from Jubilee events to appointments to the episcopacy, Vatican dicasteries. Former auxiliary bishop of Melbourne, Anthony Ireland, was appointed the new Archbishop of Hobart in Tasmania. This is the second major Australian appointment in recent days, after Bishop Shane McKinlay was named for Brisbane last week. Bob, since we did the podcast last week, people have been asking, was Bishop McKinlay in the pipeline? Did the Pope have to kind of allow this to proceed? But under either auspices, whether he did it of his own choice or he was the head of the dicastery of bishops anyway, so he clearly had a hand in this. It was a deliberate choice, is my point.
Well, look, some people I know put this in baseball terms, that he's batting 500. That he did well in Tasmania at Hobart. He didn't do quite as well in Brisbane, as they say in Australia. But look, we tend to look at this through the lens of kind of theology and where things are headed generally in the church. Bishops' appointments, I've said this before, they sometimes can be more complicated than that. Now, we don't know whether he was on top of this or not. What he does seem to be doing, however, at this point, he's kind of going back to be more cooperative with local bishops and other officials in the church when he makes these appointments. We know that Francis tended to fly right over the head of everyone. If he had met someone from some country that he was very impressed with, suddenly they became a cardinal, for example. But I think we need to give him a little bit more time, because we're going to see still some holdovers across the way. There are some people who have been saying for years that we should have had a different type of cardinal archbishop here in Washington, D.C. And I think that's probably true. I think what we have now is someone that's identified so politically with one wing of the church and of the world that it makes it a little bit more difficult for him to operate, but that Leo, back then, who was the prefect of the dicastery for bishops, wasn't able to manage that because of local objections.
Father, Leo also named a group of new voting members of the dicastery for religious, which includes 4 superior generals of women orders and a laywoman to lead this secular institute. This seems to carry over Pope Francis's practice of greatly expanding women's roles in the church. What's happening?
Yes, this is a very serious issue for the church because, the dicasteries were formerly called congregations, and congregations were congregations of cardinals who assisted the cardinal prefect. Now, they also included bishops and others, but it was viewed as an exercise, as some kind of auxiliary way of governance that was executed through the congregation. So the Congregation of Bishops has a prefect who is a cardinal, and he proposes nominations of the Pope for bishops. So it's all about governing the church. Pope Francis said lay people can exercise the power of governments in the Roman Curia. And that's why we have a prefect of the Dicastery for Religious who is a woman, and now the second in command is also a woman. Now we have all of these women
members. Yeah,
I have nothing against women. The issue is they're not ordained. The shepherds of the church are those who are made such by receiving sacred orders. And this is a very serious issue that's not going away in the church. And
is it in canon law at all?
Yes, it is in canon law. That you can't, all of the congregation prefects all were cardinals. So now they're not, because Pope Francis changed the law. But behind it is a canonical innovation that's supported by, among others, Cardinal Ghirlanda, Jesuit canon, has taught me, brilliant guy, but I disagree with him on this. But the notion is we're becoming more like a secular authority. You know, how many women were in Congress in the year 1900? Maybe one, I don't know if any. Now we have a lot, which is great, but that's because the people are sovereign. They elect who they want. In the church, the leaders of the church are those ordained.
The shepherds.
The shepherds.
Yeah. On the Feast of Corpus Christi, Pope Leo led what I think is an historic Eucharistic procession from the Lateran to the St. Mary Major, about a mile away. And he did it on foot. It was really an extraordinary, beautiful event, which we haven't seen in a long time, a Pope processing with a monstrance through the streets of Rome. Bob, your thoughts, and what does this event say about the style of Pope Leo? What is he trying to communicate, do you think?
Well, I have actually been in Rome when they have their pro-life march, and I'll tell you, that too is quite something, because the Italians kind of look around, they haven't seen this before, and they look around and they say, wow, I guess the church is still, alive and kicking, you know? So I think that what we're going to see with him, it's a younger look, it's a more positive outlook. I mean, he spoke to both a group of bishops and a group of seminarians this past week, and if you read those I don't want to call them lectures, but kind of discourses that he presented, they're very encouraging. They're very positive. You get the impression that he's not scolding people because they haven't done something, or trying to drive them into doing something. He's kind of saying, look, I'm on your side, but we're all on Jesus' side. And then he kind of exposes what that means. Yeah,
on the Papal Posse this week on Arroyo Grande, we got into the Pope's homily of Corpus Christi, and Father Jerry had some very pointed observations that I won't ruin now, worth hearing. There was also, as Bob mentioned, this celebration, a jubilee for the clergy and religious this week. Pope Leo, he had this rather spirited conversation with seminarians, and Bob's right, there was a huge contrast. It was very uplifting, calling them to underscoring the sacrifice they're making, the important witness it is in the middle of the world. Contrast that with the scolding clericalism and rigidity talks that Pope Francis really gave all 12 years.
No, I credit Pope Leo with this positive, encouraging attitude. I mean, we have difficulty getting people into seminaries. The last thing we need is to have their formation dominated by the idea you're going to be a threat to the people of God because of the way you're so clerical. That's nonsense. And it was evident during the last pontificate that most priests and seminaries didn't feel that was an accurate analysis. It's very encouraging. The Eucharistic procession, that was encouraging because what do we see? The Pope himself following the way Jesus walked through the Holy Land, and he's carrying the Lord. I remember this was, somebody once said, you can have a beautiful church, but you really want to make it very beautiful, fill it with people. And I think it's the same thing. Rome is a beautiful eternal city. It's the city, of the apostles, Peter and Paul. You want to make it really beautiful, have the faithful out there, clergy and laity, processing.
I want to get to one other thing because we're so tight on time. There is a worldwide shortage, as you mentioned, in priestly vocations. Pope Leo met with the French bishops this week, where there is a dire shortage. A glaring omission from the meeting, the vocations and ordinations within traditionalist communities. France is really one of the places where the traditional Latin Mass communities were thriving, particularly among the young. Father, what do you make of that omission? We've seen similar reactions when bishops are investigated for having too many traditional priests and seminarians. So when these seminarians are coming for tradition, they're just ignored, they're erased.
Yeah, well, this is a big problem in France and elsewhere, which is the refusal to recognize the extent of interest in the Latin Mass among laity, families, and young men who want to become priests. So for the French hierarchy has not understood that they need to recognize people who want to go to the Latin Mass are just as Catholic as the people who go to the new Mass. We should treat them with just as much respect.
But if it's working, if it's an attractive source of vocations, why wouldn't you shine more light on it, Bob? There seems to be an ideological presupposition here that if it's a traditional seminarian or vocation, we're just going to erase that, pretend it's not happening. That may be all that is happening.
Yeah, just this week there was a projection done of the number of priests that in the future that are going to be in France, and just about now the lines are beginning to cross. The traditional priests, they're older, they're dying off. There aren't many vocations. They're dipping down, and the traditional priests are coming up. And The survey projected that by 2035, the traditional priests will be a majority. It'll be a smaller number of priests than in the past, but they will be a majority of the priests in France. So like it or not like it, either you want to just entirely drive the whole operation into the ground, or you look at what's the up and coming element in the church at this point. Look, if you're a young man and you're interested in becoming a priest, do you want to become a priest in a church that is basically just like the world, except, we sprinkle holy water and we do incense and have some strange rites.
No,
now
the
and
incense
No
is in the
incense.
traditional mass.
That's right. They leave the incense, Bob.
No, but you get my point.
Yeah.
What you want is something, you want something energetic, something you can really be committed to, that you can bring to people, that you sacrifice your life for. People want heroic, holy lives.
Yeah, they want mystery. They want mystery. But, with no disrespect meant to the guitar masses. But, gentlemen, before we run out of time, we have to address alarming incidents that occurred this week. On Sunday, June 22nd, a suicide bomber attacked an Orthodox church in Syria. First opening fire on 350 worshipers, then detonating an explosive vest. At least 25 were killed, over 60 injured. Pope Leo sent condolences to the Patriarch of Antioch. The Syrian government did ID the Islamic State as responsible. Closer to home, a man attempted to carry out a mass shooting at a Christian church in suburban Detroit, Michigan. He was eventually shot dead. Bob, what is driving this? These are Christians being targeted because of their belief.
Yeah, sad to say, this event, as you know, I just wrote a book about this, and I'm rather sensitive to it as a result. But sad to say, in Islamic areas, these things crop up, and we in the West tend to dismiss them as, well, they're extremists, they're doing this and that. No, there's a pervasive pattern of this occurring everywhere in the Middle East, where ISIS or other radical groups are able to mount such attacks. In places like in Central Africa, in Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, etc., that central belt of Africa, it's going on daily. There are probably 5,000 Christians killed every year in Nigeria. It's moved out into Asia. So, look, Islam is a militant faith. We tend to forget this. We can all try to get along. A lot of Muslims, of course, are peaceful people who just want to live, at least on a daily basis, live and let live. But it is a militaristic faith. It seeks to establish a caliphate over the whole world. It believes that when the caliphate is globalized, that is when Islam will reach its peak. And it's not a matter of conversion. It's a matter of, in some instances, conquest, and that's what you see in cases like this.
Father, last word.
Yes, no, the incidence of religious violence overseas is very troubling. In our own country, it continues to bother me to no end. And this is sad, that we have people who are convinced that they solve their problems by picking up a gun and killing people, and go to a church. That is a diabolical aspect of this whole thing, the hatred of people who are praying to God. So we have to pray for, conversion of hearts, but then sad to say, we also have to be more vigilant. And, thank God they had an armed guard at that church.
Yeah, and I guess he got a truck and ran the guy over to hold him back.
Terrible attempt.
Posse, we will leave it there. For commentary from Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, visit thecatholicthing.org, and don't miss the Prayerful Posse show, dropping Friday at the Arroyo Grande Show YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, gents. Always fun.
Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you.